Good morning and welcome to another 50 Acres Academy webinar. Please do let me know if you're having any problems hearing me. I'm not located in a capital city. I'm just located a little way out of Canberra, but it's far enough to make the internet not be friendly at times. So today's webinar is something that's really interesting to me, and it's something that I've been thinking a lot about in recent months. It's something that I've sort of got a little bit of a minor addiction to of late, which is, a lot cheaper than, clothes shopping, for example. But it's podcasts, and I think it's going to be something that that you're going to find really interesting. Today, we're actually streaming this live on Instagram as well as a bit of an experiment. It's all a big wide open world at the moment, and I think it's really fascinating how everything is developing. So we've got the capacity to take questions from you, obviously, if any of you have been on this webinar series with us before. So just pop your questions into the box and I will get to them as they come. Very happy to take any questions that anyone might have as we go along. So today's webinar is really simply, what are podcasts? Do I need one? Everyone's thinking about them. How do I set it up? And, what is it going to achieve for me really effectively? So let me just move. Yeah, great. So essentially podcasting enables you to get your message out, I think, and grow your audience and gain influence. I suppose that's it in a nutshell in many respects. We're going to go through the technical know-hows, what you need to do, and it's actually surprisingly really simple. You could probably do a podcast using your phone, to be honest. So it's actually not too hard, and it's like anything, you've got to start somewhere. All of us, even Lady Gaga, started with 0 followers on one platform or other, although after last night's Super Bowl performance, I suspect she's got a few more. But, we're all going to start somewhere. And so podcasts, again, is an incremental thing to build from scratch. And along the way, I think you can also develop an interesting engagement with some of your guests as well and broaden out your network in different ways. So I think we'll be exploring some of that today. So what we're going to look at today is what is podcasting and why is it so popular? What are the benefits of doing it? How can you get started? How can you make it work? And as I said before, just any questions, just throw them into the box and I will get to them as we proceed through today. So what is podcasting? Well, I'm sure many of you are avid podcast listeners. If you're not, jump on to, iTunes or, wherever it is that you look for your potential podcast feeds and have a look around. We'll get to some of the suggested ones later, but, there's podcasts for everything. It's quite extraordinary. It's an online audio content that's delivered via an RSS feed. It's not the same RSS sort of feed that you might get that delivers blogs to an RSS feeder. I subscribe to something called Feedly, which allows me to look at all the blogs that I'm interested in. There's, it's a specific podcast app that enables you to, throw those podcasts into a particular feed that you can go to rather than going into them in each and every time. And you can set it so that it can update them and download them automatically, etc. Many people liken podcasting to radio and on demand, and it's increasingly the way that radio is delivering. And it's interesting and something it's sort of unfathomable on the same level to me as I'm watching, the demise or the sort of impact of the impact of say Radio National, which is increasingly going to podcasts and doing less live programming. I suppose it's sad on one side of the equation, but on the other, it allows some different types of programming as well. Nonetheless, those programs need to be done. The benefit of a podcast to a radio station, such as the ABC, is that they're able to be repurposed and replayed many times. So you don't have to have live production right through the day. You can have some quality programs that are then put forward through the day. So really, in reality, though, podcasting gives a lot more options in terms of content programming than radio does. In addition, podcasting allows listeners to determine the time and the place that they listen. You don't have to have the radio on. You don't have to be near a radio. You can be out of radio reach, but you can listen to a podcast. And it means that they decide what programming they want to receive and when they want to listen to it, which is what we all want these days, isn't it, in some respects? So podcasting is really taking off, and I'm sure you don't need me to tell you this, but it's about 1/3 of Americans, this is some stats out of the States, this is sort of the best we can do. There's not a lot of research about it in Australia at the moment. About 1/3 of Americans now say they have listened to a podcast. Podcast listeners in the US grew by 23% between 2015 and 2016. The monthly podcast listenership has increased 75% in the US since 2013, which is obviously huge numbers there. The same number of Americans listen to podcasts as actively use Twitter. And more organisations are investing in podcasts. The New York Times announced a new podcast team in March 2016. Fairfax is using a crime podcast and has other podcasts. The ABC has a whole stack of them, including ABC's Classic FM, which launched a new podcast series, Classic Flow, in September of last year. Southern Cross Austereo inked a deal to launch Podcast One Australia in November last year. And General Electric, even big corporates are getting in on the act, launched its first ever Australian podcast series exploring young innovators late last year as well. So, everyone's getting in on the act. So why is podcasting really popular? I suppose there's a whole bunch of reasons, and this is some of them. It's convenient. You can enjoy it anywhere, anytime. If you're a parent, you're driving in the car and all your kids are in the back listening to something or watching whatever it is on their devices, you can get in on the act as well. You don't have to talk to your husband or to your wife or to your partner or to whoever. You can just put your earphones in and listen to a podcast and go into another world. And it's also, it is about saving time. It's ideal for today's multitaskers. So, while you're walking around the lake on your daily strolls to try and get fit to deal with the stress of modern life, you can also be listening to a podcast. You can be doing it as you're driving through the radio. So there's a whole range of ways you can multitask. It easily fits into your daily routine. You can, listen at different times. It's intimate. It's private. It's portable listening experience. I listen to a whole bunch of different podcasts about all sorts of different things, from, women in business to entrepreneurs to health to healthy eating, and I suppose I develop a real connection to the people who present. If they do it properly and they're good presenters, I really get to understand them. I hear their voice. I get to hear them a lot. I get to hear them an hour a week. And it can be it could be 25 minutes, whatever it is. But it's a lengthy experience that I get to spend with them and to develop some sort of relationship and intimacy with them. It can be intellectual. It allows you to unpack and delve deeper. And there's something for really anyone out there, whatever you want to do, whatever story, whatever you're into, there's a podcast for you. Believe me, once you get looking there, it's just extraordinary. So, what are the implications? Well, brands see podcasting as the next frontier of native advertising and content marketing. And there's no surprise to that. It is a more intimate platform. And I think one of the things that I picked up on in the last couple of months, particularly in the face of the election of the Trump regime, or the Trump presidency and his team, I called it a regime, sorry, in the States, it's, people are scrambling to work out how we're going to deal with this. And I suppose there's a lot of people who are saying we're dealing with, all sorts of huge amounts of disruption and disenfranchisement. And we're seeing that in Australia. We're seeing that, today Cory Bernardi's leaving the coalition and moving to somewhere, to the Australian Conservatives. In relation to, something that's more intimate, podcasts can create that nurturing, intimate relationship. And I think there is a move away, and a lot of trend analysts are saying it, that there's a move away from just tweeting or just putting something on Facebook to actually connecting with people in a real way, whether that's in a face-to-face event or whether it's something like a podcast. So someone's just asked me a question. I'll just jump in and answer this. What do I consider essential for being a good presenter? Can you recommend any tips, tricks, or resources for someone who does not have any media training but's interested in presenting a podcast? Natasha, I will be getting to that in just a minute. Just bear with me. That is something that we're addressing just in a few slides' time. So what's the future of content consumption? People talk about content. Content is key. Content's God. What is this stuff called content? I think I've been reading content since I was a baby, and I was born last century. We're just badging it differently. But I think different content appeals to different people. Data suggests that adults aged, 18 to 34 don't visit news sites, read print newspaper, or watch television news, or seek out news in great numbers. This generation often spends more time on social networks and devices than anything else. So I was listening to a radio program just a couple of days ago. I was in a cab in Melbourne going to a meeting, and the ABC presenter had a studio full of Year 12 media students. So these are 17, 18-year-olds, and they were being asked how they got their news about the world. And they were all asked, there was about 10, 15 of them, whether they read any newspapers. And to a man, or to a boy and a girl, they all said no. One of them put up their hand and said, yes, he bought one once for a project, a bit like how he had to go into a newsagent, how we used to go into the newsagent to buy a piece of cardboard to put our project on many years ago. He had bought a newspaper once. They were getting their information from a whole variety of ways, but not newspapers. Online, yes, some of those online contents, that they would go to some news sites, but never hard copy. And some of them talked about podcasts, some of them talked about YouTube, they talked about BuzzFeed, talked about Instagram as a source of news. So I think it's many and varied. I think podcasts are becoming part of that, way of getting a dedicated audience that part of that dispersed audience that we've all got to try and search for. And that's what we're doing, whether that is a 90-year-old person who is interested in gardening or whatever they're interested in, or philosophy or classical music, through to an 18-year-old who's interested in perhaps some more recent thinking that reflects what they're into. That's where podcasts can come in. So what's the benefits of podcasts? Well, there's a huge audience reach. One of the most famous podcasts, Serial, I'm sure some of you have listened to it. I was absolutely addicted to it for a while whilst it's on, and I hope it comes back. From the creators of This American Life, became a global phenomenon, with downloads hitting more than 1 million week by week. And I'm sure the next series will be even bigger. And I think they are planning another series. iTunes has more than 800 million accounts, while SoundCloud has over 250 million. You can hone in on valuable targets, and who are specifically interested in actual topics that you are trying to focus their attention on. It's ideal for thought leadership and positioning. It can help you to build your profile as a trusted expert and industry leader. Sorry, I'm just trying to move it forward. So let's think about how we're going to get started, and we will get to the presentation tactics and tips just in a minute. So, first of all, we need to, listen to what's out there. If you're thinking about doing a podcast, it really doesn't matter what you're doing it on. It might be that you're, a student in a particular area of knowledge, and you're really just trying to develop a global group of people who may be interested in what you're doing and what you're working on, because there's always a group of people who are interested in everything. Or it might be that, you're trying to help build your brand or your business, or, build a cult of personalities, of a personality, or whatever it is. It's time, I think, first to do some due diligence and listen to what's out there. So listen to a bunch of podcasts that you think are sort of similar to what you're thinking about doing, and also listen to some other professional podcasts, ones that have got big audiences. See what they do. Check them out. These are some of the ones that I would suggest listening to. The Daily, How I Built This, Radiolab, This American Life is fantastic. They've been doing it a long time and they're brilliant. Doing Good, and Intercepted. There's so many more. That's just one place to start. So you've got to obviously pick the right name. Simple and catchy is best. Choose something that's memorable, that speaks to your topic and also to your audience. So obviously, and also not something that's too similar to something else. So if you've got, you're interested in doing a women's business podcast of some description, obviously make sure that it's got something different to everyone else's is women's business podcast. Otherwise, no one's going to remember your name. Podcasts also need some branding. So you need a name, as well as a name, you need colours, a logo, perhaps some music to introduce. Some of them, if you listen to them at the beginning, they usually have some music. Some of them are a little bit over the top. Some of them are quite nice and simple. Obviously, you've got to pick something that, you've got permission to use, and perhaps sound effects throughout it, if you're relevant, if you can, depending on the editing that you've got to do. I mean, I've listened to some ones that are very basic, but that have very big audiences, and there is nothing wrong with going, a little bit sort of rural and rustic with your podcast to begin with, whilst you're still setting up, and whilst you don't want to necessarily afford to go out and buy a whole lot of new equipment and invest in a whole lot of other stuff. But obviously, to build your brand and build what you're doing it professionally is going to help. So let's choose a format. Obviously, you need to think about how many hosts you might have. Is it just you, or is it you and another person? Is it, are you Hamish and Andy? Are you, who are you? Is it you and your business partner? Is it you and your mum, you and your dog? You and the bloke down the street. What are you going to be doing? Are you just talking to people? Is telling a story, or are you interviewing guests? Obviously, the most commonplace podcast is usually interviewing, because it's easy. I can sit here, obviously I'm sitting here talking to you for 45 minutes. I've got some words to talk to, but, it's easier if you have, I think, someone to talk to and interview. It propels itself. It becomes this lovely discussion thing. One of our top tips here is that obviously many listeners find discussion between multiple hosts more interesting than just one person talking. This was what I was just saying. With multiple hosts, you can also split the work required to produce the podcast. So, or if it's only just you, obviously do a shorter podcast so that you can actually staff it and manage it. Choose topics, in terms of your topic selection, choose topics that you're passionate about and that you understand, or that you have expertise in, or that you have a genuine interest and fascination in, so that when you're talking to someone, you really do convey the fact that you are genuinely interested in what it is they're talking about, and you're bouncing off those people, and you can feel the genuine energy in that discussion. So topics could include current affairs, industry trends, niche. It could be niche if you're doing something in terms of an academic area, or more broad in terms of if you're talking something much more broad, like women in business, or whatever it might be. Script writing. Well, obviously, you can write a script. For example, today I am doing this pretty ad lib. It's what I do pretty much most of the time for people who join me for a lot of webinars, and we've been doing this for a good 18 months, 2 years now, probably know my style. I tend to sort of riff a bit, obviously try and give you some information that's helpful, but I tend to be personal in the way I do it. I haven't done a podcast. I'm intending on doing one very soon in a couple of different ways. We're about to launch a separate offering for startups and entrepreneurs in a month or so. But for people who know how I do it, that's probably how I would approach a podcast in a conversational way. I probably wouldn't have a script, particularly if I was interviewing someone. I'd have some questions that I wanted to achieve. But I've worked in TV and I've worked in radio, and so I'm familiar with pausing to allow them to talk so you can hear them, not talking over them. All those similar tactics and tips apply with a podcast as they do with a TV or radio interview. So if you're thinking about how you do a TV or radio interview, if you were listening to something on the 7:30 program and Lee Sales is interviewing the Prime Minister and they just talked at each other, you couldn't hear either of them. So that one has to stop while the other one is talking. Otherwise, you don't hear the audio clearly. It's a pretty simple thing, but it's harder in practice when you're actually sitting with someone, because if you think about a conversation in a coffee shop with someone, you often do talk over each other and stumble over each other's words. You have to be a little bit more disciplined in a podcast. You have to obviously be mindful of when they stop, but don't leave too much of a gap when you are interviewing them. We'll get into a bit more of this technique stuff in a second. Project your personality, I think, is really important. Now, I say here crack jokes. I mean, I used to say it wasn't a good webinar unless I made some sort of joke about a green smoothie, and that sort of still applies. But what is cracking jokes to one is an uncomfortable thing for another. I think you've got to reflect your personality and don't take yourself too far out of your comfort zone. I think if you appear curious and passionate, you'll get an audience and you'll convince people that you're interested. Obviously, you don't have to crack jokes if it's a serious program about some sort of particular niche area of academia. But it's about being conversational and reflecting the sort of person that you are. So the other question I think a lot of people ask is, how long should the podcast be? Well, the average attention span of an adult listening to a lecture is about 15 to 20 minutes. So, there is, obviously you can do a longer podcast than that. You can do a shorter one. I'm listening to ones that are ranging from 15 minutes through to 2 hours, and I sit there and listen to them. I'm particularly fascinated with healthy and clean eating and vegetarian. I mean, I'm not vegetarian, but I'm interested in thinking about and learning about vegetarian nutrition. And so I listen to some really interesting podcasts that sometimes go for an hour and a half or 2 hours, and I'll sit there and listen to them. I couldn't be questioned on the content of the whole 2 hours, but I often will have it in the background. And so if I'm listening to something, it's a bit like when you are listening to an Audible book or something on TV that you can rewind. If you hear something that you think's fascinating, you can jump in and rewind it and listen to it and go back, which is the beauty of a podcast. Someone has just asked me what podcast do I listen to for healthy eating. I listen to a guy called Rich Roll, R-I-C-H, new word, R-O-L-L. He's a US guy. He's actually a vegan. He doesn't just do stuff on eating, and I'm not a vegan, but I'm interested in the awareness that vegetarian and healthy eating brings to nutrition. And he does a whole lot of stuff about it. I mean, he's an athlete and all sorts of stuff. I'm not an athlete, I hasten to add, but I'm an aspirant athlete, a mother of two. But nonetheless, I think it's he's a great guy. And if you go on to YouTube and have a look, not YouTube, sorry, iTunes and have a look, they'll probably suggest some other ones. But that's my favourite one at the moment. The other guy that I listen to, he actually doesn't do a podcast, but he does. It's a site online, and it's called Nutrition Facts. He's a doctor, actually, an integrated doctor. Again, he's a vegetarian, but he gives some really interesting facts about how you can get all sorts of different nutritional things that go into your diet. I know we're digressing, but I hope that helps. So, I think it's about what makes you comfortable in terms of the length of the podcast. Obviously, don't do something that is going to be difficult for you to produce. Maybe start small and get big and see how you grow. Obviously, you've got to create a production schedule because, like anything else, it's a bit like, a lot of the clients that we work with, they'll go, oh, we want to do Twitter, we want to do Facebook, we want to do this. But we'll do it ourselves. We just tell us what to do. And so we might give them some suggestions or whatever, and or whoever it is that and people go on to Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, and you go to their feeds and they've done one post, and you're a bit disappointed because you hoped for more. So it's a bit like that. You really do need to have a production schedule. If you're going to commit to it, you need to tell people that you're going to do it. Like today, I've advertised this webinar, and I'm here to do it at 11 o'clock. If you advertise that you're going to do a podcast, you've got to deliver it. And then you've got to tell the people that are perhaps interested that you're going to do it, and perhaps how regular that you will do it. And maybe do it less regular than you think you can do because, everyone's always busy and you can probably do less than you think. So maybe start every 2 months or every month or, whatever it is you think you can really manage based on what content you've got. And so perhaps write yourself a 6-month schedule. And make sure it's consistent. So obviously, timing is important, but also product is important. So, if one week you're just going to talk to them about what you had for dinner, they're going to turn off. If the next week you're going to talk to them about some really interesting thing and you're going to interview someone that's really fascinating, then you're gonna grow that audience. So, you've got to keep that quality up. You've got to keep the consistency up in terms of the number that you're doing as well. So how do you promote the podcasts? Well, it's however you really promote things broadly, but you should at least promote them a week before your podcast is scheduled. If it is part of your brand growth strategy and it's important for your company, for example, or your organization, you could even do some paid posts on Instagram, or you could do some stuff on Facebook or Twitter, or if you've got a large network, just use your network. Obviously, the ways that you can do it is tell people through an EDM, your marketing email platform, social media, or leverage your co-hosts and your guests for their promotion. So if you're interviewing someone who's got a big network, make sure that they get in on the act too, because it's good for them as well to obviously co-promote it. What are the sorts of platforms, how do you host your podcast? People often go, oh, that's good. How do I do it? What's the pointing in? Where's the technical stuff? Well, podcast host platforms provide tools for sharing your podcast with the world. There's also analytics and ways to generate advertising income. So, if you're looking for that, you can obviously think about advertising as well. Some of the ideas, some of the people that I listen to, they have sponsored posts. I listen to, if anyone's interested in the women's entrepreneur space, I listen to something called Girl Boss Radio. But most of the podcasts that I listen to, even This American Life, I think, yes, This American Life does have sponsored posts at the beginning where the hosts read out an ad. So, if I was doing a podcast, Richard Roll reads out an ads about, fair trade undies. Maybe that's where I'm going to have to go next. But, someone gets sponsored and, that's the way to raise revenue. You've got to build an audience before you're going to get revenue. Obviously, if you have a revenue of zero, if you have an audience of zero, you're not going to get many people wanting to invest as a sponsor, unless you've got a huge network to begin with and you're jumping in on this, and you could demonstrate that you can harness your large audience. Then you might get some sponsors. Or if you've got a host of celebrities and high profile people to interview, then you potentially could get sponsorship right from day dot. And that's something that never discount options before you explore them is the way I'd go. Some of the platforms that you could look to host your podcast are SoundCloud, iTunes, Amazon S3, Libsyn, Podomatic, or Buzzsprout. They're just some of the platforms that are around. So you need to log in and have a look at what they offer and how they work. How do you make it work? Well, obviously you've got to focus on your audience. You've got to cater to those particular people. Obviously very important to sort of cater for them for long-term success, because if you come up with a sort of randomized group of topics that you don't, that aren't consistent, one week you're talking about, baking banana bread, the next week you're talking about what you're growing in your garden, and then you throw to some sort of digital platform trends, people aren't going to know whether they're Arthur or Martha. And if you're growing an audience, unless you're extraordinary, unless you are Lady Gaga or someone with extraordinarily phenomenal personal appeal, you're going to have too much of a dispersed group of topics there. So I think you need to decide on what you're going to do and why you're doing it and who you're targeting. And, often those tribes are very big and very large. It's just about reaching them and letting them know where you're coming from and what you're going to do. But I think people these days do demand consistency, and they also expect to be at the center of your universe. You need to be talking to them. You need to be establishing some sort of rapport. I can remember one of the very first webinars that I did. I went down to Pro Bono Australia in Melbourne, and they had something like 1,000 people registered for the webinar. There was about 600 or 700 that logged in on the day. And I'm thinking to myself, well, I could be intimidated by the concept of, 600 or 700 literally listening at the end of the thing, or I could actually just speak to one or two people at the end of the phone. And that's what I did, and that's what I do. And I suppose it's about making sure that you are communicating to those people, because there's this human being at the other end of that relationship, and you've got to be able to try and project yourself as a person through that experience. Otherwise, you just won't get them committed to what you're doing. Rehearsing is obviously a good thing to do. I mean, I never rehearse for these. I just jump on the phone and get a cup of coffee and get the slides and off I go. Obviously we'll give some attention if I'm doing a keynote address, but depending on who you are and how practiced you are and how confident you are, I think rehearsing is a good thing to do. And some of the ways that you can practice to build up some of that confidence is talking to yourself, obviously in a room where there's no one else or no one who's going to make any judgments about you talking to yourself. Present in front of your friends or family. Obviously they need to be friends, real friends. Tell a story or read a book out loud. Sounds dumb, but it's important. If you've got someone that you could read Harry Potter to, go for it, because you can project yourself. I mean, I was listening, I don't know whether anyone was listening to Patricia Carvalho last night on Radio National, and she had Arthur Sinodinos on radio. And I actually have, a great deal of respect for Arthur Sinodinos, but he has a very monotone voice when he presents. And so when you listen to him, he just stays on that one level. He doesn't go up much, he doesn't go down much. And what he really needs is some talking to, really, from his media advisor and some training. And it's hard to retrain yourself when you're 50-something or 60-something, but it's about trying to go up a bit. And I'm sort of ramping this up now for you, but it's sort of trying to get some, and I'm overdoing this now, but it's really trying to project yourself and, trying to convey some of that enthusiasm in what you're doing. And one of the things that I say to people when I'm doing media training is, if you're doing something positive, if you're doing an interview that's positive, two things you can do: stand up while you're doing the interview. I mean, I'm sitting down here, but if you are someone who thinks you need a bit of, support in this area, stand up and also smile. Now, obviously, if it's a serious, negative, topic, then you don't want to be smiling. But if you're smiling, if you think about smiling versus frowning or not, or just speaking as sort of flat, then it obviously conveys, if you just, talk to someone this afternoon or just to yourself later, And smile versus not smiling, it's quite extraordinarily different when you are actually talking. And so you can think about some of those ways that you might, when you're on the phone to someone on a mobile phone call, if you sort of crawl up in a little ball on the couch, you know, you can tell that that's a different feel to if you're sort of sitting up with your chest sort of, you know, up and lots of air coming into your lungs, and you can actually talk to people in a very positive, enthusiastic way. So it's just about those simple things about how you actually convey that information. Obviously, you got to avoid the perfection trap. So, you know, I've media trained a lot of people, and you know, I media trained quite a lot of people last year, and there was one person that I media trained who had to present a handful of people that I had to media train. But there was one particular person that I had to media train who had to present at a conference, and this person had to present part of a large report. And they were, you know, very, very highly intelligent. All these people that I was training on this particular session were all PhDs. They all were all doctors. But they had to read it out. They were not able to talk spontaneously and off the cuff. Now, if that's you, you really need to do some practicing to do a podcast, because if you read a podcast down the line, it's going to come out like that. It's not going to come out in the way that you probably need to be communicating to grow an audience. That's a different thing from, say, practicing to perfection, where I think, you know, do you want to get to the point where you know what's on the next slide exactly and how many minutes you're going to take on the next slide versus the one after? I don't think so. Obviously, you want to know that you're not going to spend 3 hours on the podcast. But, you know, if it goes to 27 minutes as opposed to 24, that's okay. I think, you know, it is a bit of a hit and miss thing to begin with, and perfection is not, I think, what you're aiming for. And overly polished and certainly reading out content is not where you want to go. So that's where we've got to today. And you know, that's you know, the sort of podcast in a nutshell. If there are any questions, please do jump in and ask me. And we've got another podcast next month, which is sort of my pet topic at the moment, particularly in the face of what I just referred to before as the Trump regime, but maybe I'll just continue to say that. Distrust, disorder, and disenfranchisement. How do brands and organisations navigate this changing world and forge relationships that survive? You know, really about communications in this whole very changing world that's happening at the moment. So that's what we're going to do next month. And in fact, this year I'm going to have a whole sort of theme of new trends, new platforms, new learning as we go through this year. So please, if anyone's got any questions, please jump on and ask me. I've just had a question. Can you say something about the difference between videos and podcasts? Well, look, I'm doing a video at the moment, and I am doing this is my first Instagram live video. So for those people who are watching me, I apologise. You're looking in my kitchen and my screen, and you know, I'm sure that's fascinating, and I will improve, I promise, as we go forward. Videos can be used in all sorts of ways. So you can speak to a video. One of the best sets of videos that I've ever seen, I think, is some of the ones that the McGrath Foundation have used over the years. And they are great. They communicate a real sort of, you know, emotional connection. A video can be cinematic. You can bring all sorts of other techniques, and depending on your budget and your ability personally, or people that you've got around you, you can embrace all sorts of different techniques in a video, or it could be just you speaking to camera. A podcast, obviously, you record. I mean, if you really want to go for broke, you know, you could put your recording of your podcast on Facebook Live and to Instagram Live at the same time as recording a podcast, and then do it later. I mean, that's probably a bit of overkill. I'm playing around with Instagram Live today because I've never done it before, and I just thought I may as well try it. I think the pros and cons of both is really video. You need to be able to be confident enough to speak in front of a video, because if you're flat and dull and uninteresting, it's a bit like a YouTube blogger. And I'm sure lots of you or some of you have perhaps followed or watched YouTube bloggers or vloggers. They can be great or they can be dull, and you need to be able to project yourself to be able to get an audience. Podcasts, I think, you can do them quickly, more efficiently, less equipment, less budget impact, and you can do some of them on the phone. You could do some of them on Skype. You can do some of them down the line. You can do some of them as you're out and about. So, I think they're easy to put together, less onerous videos, unless it's just you speaking to camera. Videos usually require some editing, which obviously requires some skill. So that's probably, I'd say, the difference between the two of them. If anyone else has got any other questions, please jump in now. Otherwise, we'll probably wrap up in a second. But don't hesitate to jump on and join us for the next webinar. It should be fun. It's sort of a pet topic of mine at the moment. I'm going to be interested to explore it for next month. And through the years, as I said, it'll be, a whole lot of stuff about, trends and new platforms and new stuff really going forward, which I think hopefully you and I will find interesting. So thanks a lot for joining us today for this 50 Acres Academy webinar, and I'm really pleased that you could. Have a lovely day. I hope you enjoy the rest of the day. I'm going to be listening to Parliament soon, because I think Cory Bernardi will be stepping down or moving to the crossbench, which will be an interesting day. So, but that's just me. I'm one of those political obsessives. But thanks so much, and lovely to speak to you all.